What if the plate beneath your dinner was worth more than the meat sitting on top of it? And what if, after you finished eating, someone else finished it too, by eating the plate itself? Hold on to that question, because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly who eats your dinner after you do, and why that answer says more about survival than anything you have ever been taught about the Middle Ages. You push open a tavern door in England, sometime around the year 1340. Cold rain follows you inside before the door swings shut behind you, sealing out the wind but not quite the chill already soaked into your clothes. The room is dark, lit only by firelight bleeding through smoke thick enough to sting your eyes and blur every face into shadow. Wet wool hangs near the hearth, dripping slowly onto a floor already slick with mud tracked in from outside, and the air smells like tallow, ash, and something simmering that has clearly been simmering for a very long time. Somewhere in the room, somebody is coughing, low and wet, the kind of cough nobody bothers to acknowledge anymore, because illness here is simply weather, something you live alongside rather than react to. And for one uncomfortable second, a stranger near the fire lifts his eyes and studies you a little too long, the way people study anyone who has not yet earned a place in the room. You are not welcome yet. You are simply tolerated, the way every outsider is tolerated, until the room decides otherwise, until you have eaten, spoken, or proven you belong by the fire. A tavern keeper slams something heavy onto the table in front of you. Not a plate. Bread. A thick, dense square of dark maslin bread, baked the day before on purpose, so it will not collapse the moment hot stew touches it. This is your trencher. Your plate, your bowl, part of your meal, and possibly, before the night ends, part of someone else's. Hollywood taught us to imagine medieval England as endless feasts, roasted boars turning slowly over open flame, noblemen tearing into whole chickens with greasy hands, wine spilling from overflowing goblets while music drifts through candlelit halls. Hollywood lied to you about the feast. It lied a little less about the fear. Most people in medieval England never tasted anything close to that imagined feast. The roasted boar, the overflowing wine, the music drifting through candlelit halls. But the longer you sit in this tavern, the stranger and more remarkable the real system becomes. Because the pot hanging over that fire has not been emptied in days, maybe not in weeks, and the meat inside it may have been dead for months. The tavern revolves around that pot, the way a household revolves around its hearth, the way an entire life can quietly orbit one single object, without anyone ever stopping to notice. It hangs suspended from an iron hook blackened by years of smoke, and the liquid inside barely resembles anything you would call soup today. It is thick, dense, somewhere between a stew and a paste, with steam rising constantly off the surface while bubbles break slowly through layers of peas, onions, and rendered animal fat. This is pottage, and for most of medieval England, it was not one meal among many choices. It was the meal. The only meal, repeated, refined, kept alive, day after day, season after season, without ever truly beginning or ending. And that word, alive, is not an exaggeration, because this pot does not simply get cooked, it gets tended, the way you tend a fire, or a garden, or a living thing that simply refuses to die. New water goes in as old water evaporates. New vegetables get thrown in each morning before the sun has fully risen. Old ingredients keep breaking apart beneath the surface. Turnips softening into the broth, dried peas dissolving slowly into starch, leeks releasing their sweetness after hours of patient, unhurried simmering. Some of these pots outlived the people who started them. A child could grow up eating from the very same pot her grandmother once fed her own children from, generation after generation spooning out of a vessel that never technically finished cooking, never truly went cold, never started over from nothing. Nothing was discarded unless absolutely necessary, because fuel was expensive, lighting a new fire required labor nobody could spare, and keeping one fire burning continuously made far more sense than restarting from nothing every single day of the year. So the pot lived, quietly, stubbornly, long after the people who first lit that fire were gone. And somewhere inside that endlessly simmering broth was the ghost of meat. Not chunks, not steaks, not anything you could point to and call a portion. Just memory. A A salted pork bone dropped in days ago. A scrap of bacon. A sliver of smoked ham, long since dissolved, its flavor leaking slowly into everything around it until the meat itself stopped existing entirely and became something closer to a memory of flavor. A rumor of meat, rather than meat itself. Most people did not eat meat directly. They ate vegetables that remembered meat, vegetables carrying a flavor borrowed from something already gone. And maybe, before you judge that as poverty, ask yourself honestly whether your own kitchen wastes more in a single week than that entire household wasted in an entire year. That ghostly bacon, dissolving in your bowl tonight, may have been slaughtered 6 months ago. And that is not exaggeration. That is simply how the system worked, season after season, without fail. In medieval England, animals were usually killed in late autumn, once temperatures dropped and winter feed became too scarce to justify keeping them alive any longer through the cold months ahead. The moment an animal was slaughtered, the meat entered a preservation system built to keep it edible for months, sometimes the better part of a year, stretched thin across a calendar that showed no mercy to anyone who failed to plan ahead. Salt became everything. Entire pork cuts disappeared beneath thick layers of coarse salt, packed tightly into wooden barrels and left to cure in the dark. Beef strips were smoked slowly over low fires until they hardened into something closer to leather than meat, tough enough to survive months of storage without rotting. Fish were dried in coastal winds before being stacked by the thousands inside wooden casks, and no preserved food mattered more than herring, shipped inland from the North Sea in staggering quantities, cheap, durable, and absolutely essential for a Christian society required to avoid meat for nearly a third of the entire calendar year. Fridays, Lent. Endless religious fasting days stacked one after another. Fish filled that gap so constantly that medieval writings complain openly about herring fatigue, people growing exhausted by their own dinner before they had even sat down to eat it, sick of the smell before the smell even reached the table. And just as preserved meat told you how a household survived winter, the bread sitting in front of you told you exactly where that household stood in the world before a single word was ever spoken. You could read a person's entire social position simply by glancing at the color of their loaf. The darker the bread, the harder the life behind it. A nobleman ate soft white wheat bread, finely sifted, expensive, pale as the privilege that produced it. A laborer ate maslin, a dense, dark loaf of rye, barley, and lower grain mixed together, heavy enough to feel almost damp in the hand, chewy enough to exhaust the jaw with every bite, sometimes still carrying flecks of husk because perfect milling cost money nobody poor could ever spare. We like to think class signals disappeared along with the medieval world, but they simply changed shape. From the color of a loaf to the logo stitched onto a sleeve, the badge changes, the instinct never does. And that loaf of maslin, baked hard enough to survive an entire meal without collapsing, became your trencher, your plate, soaking up grease and flavor until the meal itself was finished and the bread had done its quiet, final job. But here is where the loop closes. If a wealthy household finished its meal before the trencher fell apart beneath the weight of it, that soaked, flavor-heavy bread was often gathered up by servants and handed out to the poor waiting just outside the door in the cold. So the plate beneath your dinner really could become someone else's dinner entirely, passed from hand to hand without a single word exchanged. Not pure charity, not pure kindness, but practical mercy, the kind of generosity that only makes sense in a world where absolutely nothing, not even the plate itself, could afford to go to waste. Now taste that pottage properly. Taste it the way the people in this room actually tasted it, leaning over the bowl with both hands wrapped around the warmth. And the first thing you notice is not weakness. It is intensity. Modern audiences imagine medieval peasants choking down dull gray mush because we assume poverty meant a lack of culinary knowledge. But medieval cooks understood flavor with a precision that would surprise most home cooks today, and they had to, because repetition demanded it of them every single day. When your dinner depends on the same handful of ingredients for months at a time, flavor stops being a luxury and becomes psychological survival, a quiet, daily act of resistance against monotony, against the slow grind of eating the same thing again and again without losing your mind. Onions, garlic, and leeks formed the foundation of nearly everything savory that touched the fire. Herbs went in aggressively, not delicately. Handfuls of sage, thyme, parsley, fennel, hyssop, thrown in with confidence, not careful, measured pinches. Then came acidity. Verjuice pressed from sour crab apples or unripe grapes, cutting sharply through heavy animal fat the same way a squeeze of lemon works on a plate today, brightening everything it touched. Mustard appeared constantly, freshly ground into sharp, biting pastes strong enough to overpower even aggressively salted pork. Wealthier households pushed flavor even further with imported spice, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, ginger. Treasures that connected this small, smoky tavern to trade routes stretching farther than most people in this room would ever travel in their entire lifetime. But spice was never only about taste. It was about fighting the exhaustion of sameness, the same dull ache anyone today recognizes after weeks of the same routine, the same meals, the same four walls, the particular fatigue of living a life stuck on repeat with no clear end in sight. They fought that fatigue with flavor, with herbs, with anything sharp enough to wake the tongue back up. We call it burnout. They simply called it dinner. And nothing helped people endure that repetition more than ale, sitting in clay cups all across this room, cloudy, warm, slightly sour, and almost certainly safer to drink than the water waiting outside. Nobody in 1340 understood bacteria, but people understood patterns well enough to survive by them. Wells near crowded settlements made people sick. Stagnant water killed quietly and often. Fermented drinks somehow did not. So England drank ale constantly. At every meal, in every household, and that included children. Small ale, brewed deliberately weak, often around 2% alcohol. Strong enough to be safer than water. Weak enough to drink all day without consequence or complaint. And once people gathered here around warmth, food, and shared cups, elbows nearly touching on crowded benches, this room stopped being just a place to eat. It became something closer to a network, the medieval equivalent of a signal tower in a world with no newspapers, no telegraph, no way to move information, except through a human mouth, carrying it carefully from one town to the next. A traveler walking in from the next county over was not just a stranger looking for a warm meal. He was carrying data. Which bridge collapsed in the storm? Which village was whispering nervously about plague? Which roads had turned dangerous after dark? Which fields had failed this season and which families would go hungry because of it? Merchants hired laborers beside this very fire. Farmers and traders, who would never speak a single word under any other roof, exchanged warnings freely over the same shared bowl of pottage. This tavern, this one smoky, crowded room, was quietly doing the job your phone does now, except slower, warmer, and impossible to simply scroll past without noticing the person sitting right beside you. After the pottage, sometimes, on the better nights, came frumenty, warm wheat grains boiled slowly in milk, thickened with egg yolks, sweetened with honey, occasionally colored gold with saffron, if the household could spare such a luxury. Soft, sweet, comforting in a way that needed no explanation. Because a medieval person never used the phrase comfort food, the words simply did not exist yet, but they understood the feeling completely. The way warmth and sweetness could steady a person after a long, cold, uncertain day that offered little else in the way of kindness. Even feast days, with roasted swans and decorative pies and elaborate sugar sculpture, served a quiet psychological purpose, far beyond the food itself, reminding an exhausted community that abundance still existed somewhere out there, even if it rarely reached their own modest table more than once or twice a year. But most nights were simpler than any feast. Just a bench, a fire, ale, pottage, human voices layered through smoke and low laughter, and for a few hours, the cold outside stopped mattering entirely. So, picture this tavern one final time, the same room you walked into at the very beginning of this story. Dusk settles outside, heavier now than before. Rain strikes the roof in uneven rhythm, tapping like something patient and unhurried. A traveler pushes through the door, exhausted from the road, boots soaked through, hands aching from the cold. The same kind of stranger eyed with suspicion just a few hours earlier in this very story, in this very room. And someone near the hearth slides a bowl toward him without a single word, without ceremony, without even bothering to ask his name first. The stew inside is only peas, onions, turnips, and the faint shadow of bacon simmered into the broth. Nothing special, nothing rare, but it is hot, and for one quiet moment, that is enough. More than enough. 700 years separate that traveler from you. We have electricity, refrigeration, antibiotics, grocery stores, and clean water running endlessly through metal pipes beneath our feet. The barrels disappeared. The trenchers disappeared. The pot that never stopped simmering, the one that outlived entire families, disappeared too. Eventually, the way everything eventually does. But what actually survives when everything material disappears? When the bowl is gone, the bread is gone, even the barrel rotted into nothing? Not the bowl, not the bread. The need to be let in from the cold, that single quiet need, unchanged across 7 centuries. And maybe that is the real answer to the question we opened with tonight. Who eats your plate after you? Someone always does. Whatever you build, whatever you carry, whatever you manage to keep warm long enough to share with someone else, eventually passes into different hands entirely. The way that bread passed from table to table, the way that bowl passed from stranger to stranger, the way this very story just passed quietly into yours. If stepping into forgotten corners of history like this one keeps pulling you back in, stay a while longer by this fire, because there are more rooms like this one still waiting, somewhere in the smoke, to be opened